In my last video, I talked about how, in order to heal bipolar disorder, the battle between the soul and the ego needed to come to its proper end. And the first thing we need to do is provide supportive environments so that when people go into psychosis, we allow them to embrace and engage their experience instead of blocking it fearfully. And one of the things that happens when we allow the psychosis to process is that we go through a period of purification of the soul. And during this period, we have the opportunity to rid ourselves of much of the emotional pain that we carry with us in our daily lives. So in this video, I want to provide a type of inventory of all of the different experiences that can happen to you within psychosis that allow this soul purification to take place. Before I begin, I think it's interesting to mention that all the experiences I'm going to talk about can also happen during periods of meditation, during mystic states, and they can also be induced by taking psychedelic drugs. And the reason for that is that certain meditations, mystic practices, and drugs can lead to a collapse of the ego, which I've already explained in my video, The Real Cause of Bipolar Disorder. Very often, one of the first things to happen when people enter into a psychosis is that they have a release of their biological repressions. And with that, sexual repression is usually at the top of the list. Each one of us carries some level of sexual repression with us. If we didn't, we'd all be in jail. So with our inhibitions out of the way, we may find ourselves excessively sexual or flirtatious with people. We may be what is considered to be inappropriately affectionate with people, maybe people we don't even know. Or in deep psychosis, we may even start spontaneously masturbating. We may also recognize that at almost every moment of the day we're holding in our bladders or our intestines, and we may decide to just let all that go, pissing or shitting, anytime, anywhere. Another thing that can happen, especially because your senses have come alive, is that we may have a particular fascination with these materials as well. Even in my own situation, I felt the need to pee on the carpet of a hotel ballroom and then lay right down in the urine afterwards. And probably one of the most common symptoms of manic episodes is our loss of shame. We just immediately feel the desire to get naked and do everything we can without our clothes on. Now, mania is a state that is famous for being quite high and sometimes extremely positive, and in other videos I've made, I've talked about the spiritual potential of these states, and in fact that they can be quite sacred experiences. But what happens usually is as the mania continues and you get through the oneness and connection to everything, what usually follows are regressions into experiences in your life which were emotionally painful for you, things that you probably still haven't gotten over yet, at least on an emotional level. And as a support person, being there next to somebody who is re-experiencing a trauma from their life can be very strange. Because while some people in psychosis may simply remember the experiences, others relive it. And so what will happen is when the person regresses into a painful trauma from their childhood, when you look at their face, you will see child's eyes and they may talk to you in the child's voice. And this occurs because the consciousness of the person is in another time and in another place. Now, it should be no surprise that many of these traumatic experiences revolve around physical abuse, verbal abuse, and sex abuse, especially among the most acute cases. And back in the 1960s, Dr. R.D. Laing was really the first psychiatrist to highlight the role of the dysfunctional family among people with mental disorders. In fact, one study I've come across recently showed that people suffering from schizophrenia were more than twice as likely to have divorced parents. So while trauma experienced in childhood plays a critical role in many mental disorders, trauma during adulthood can also play a role as well. And I'm not only talking about emotional issues, but physical accidents can also be a big part of the trauma which we need to heal. Death of a parent, child, or spouse is also enough to trigger a manic episode, especially among women. But in truth, the traumas which can heal during psychosis really come from any repressed memory or emotion that was too painful for us to deal with at the time that it happened. The fact that life traumas play a huge role in mental disorders should hardly be surprising. However, what will be surprising is that many people regress into the trauma they experienced at the time of their birth. In The Holotropic Mind, Stan Grof discusses in detail the different stages of our birth process and how the traumas from each stage of birth can have implications for the rest of our lives. For example, in his clinical experience, Groff has found that there is a very strong connection between the sensation of having your life being controlled by other people and being a cesarean baby. Other birth traumas which can be relived during psychosis are the use of forceps on your skull when you were a baby, the sensation that you were an unwanted pregnancy by your mother, the various sensations and emotions connected to a long and difficult delivery, like the feeling that you're being strangled or suffocated. These can be experienced as well. And even the use of alcohol, drugs, or smoking during pregnancy is something that you may regress into in order to heal. Now, the next set of regressions I'm going to talk about completely defy the mechanics of mainstream science and are completely rejected by psychiatry and mainstream psychology today. According to Groff, Perry, and many of the people who write me on my YouTube channel, there is a return to biological and organic origins that many people seem to go through as well, myself included. It's not uncommon for people to feel strong connections with their ancestors or other tribal peoples as they regress. They may have the sensation that they've experienced a past life or that they lived in another time or another place. It's very common for people to take on lower life forms, particularly animal personalities, especially apes. And in one particular case, a guy wrote me and he just told me he had the need to go down in his basement and just move around like a lizard. There can also be the sensation of having strong connections with plants or even all of life in all of creation. And along with the more earthly or planetary regressions to our origins, we also have regressions to our cosmic origins as well. People have the sensation that they've gone back to the beginning of time and space with the Big Bang. Or like I did, that they're somehow traveling through the cosmos. Other people just have this grander connection of cosmic consciousness. And then on the other end, we have people who seem to have the sensation that they're being encountered or even possessed by aliens, which isn't always a pleasant experience. Perhaps the most spiritual aspect of an acute psychosis is the actual encounter of spirits themselves. Many people have the apparent hallucination of seeing angels or seeing devils or demons of some kind. Other people feel that the spirits are near them, and often they have some sort of message for the person related to their life purpose or a vision of some type. Others feel that they're actually channeling spirits when they're in a state. And then finally, and we've seen this a few times, people have the feeling, particularly that the devil is inside them and trying to get out. To the outsider, watching someone in psychosis working with a support person, it could seem like the whole process is a whole lot more like an exorcism than it is like therapy. Now, along with releasing the repressions and traumas that we've already talked about, there's also the release of the physical energy that's associated with these traumas. And these energies are released by simply allowing the person in psychosis to do what they intuitively want to do, provided that they're not hurting themselves or other people. And as most episodes start with people in a high energy level, they may want to do some physical exercise or get them running, something like that. But then there's other deeper energies, things like physical tremors or vibrations that are just happening within the body itself. And these tremors and vibrations can be accompanied by cathartic screaming or singing or even vocalizing of particular sounds that for some reason you just feel motivated to make. You just want to make that noise. Even vomiting can occasionally occur as the person releases the biochemicals that are associated with their traumas. When a person has a volcanic eruption of physical energy coming out of them, sometimes afterwards there's like a blackout period where they just go away. And whereas in that situation families or doctors may panic and try and revive the person, Dr. Groff recognizes the blackout as the period of healing in itself and lets the person come back on their own. Another way that the body spontaneously releases traumatic energy while you're in psychosis is that it accelerates your heartbeat. And when that happens spontaneously for no other reason, you immediately start to breathe quicker. You start to hyperventilate, and that hyperventilation increases the oxygen, which releases trauma. The release of Kundalini energies can also be part of this process. I'm going to talk about my Kundalini experience in another video, but for now just know that they feel like very strong energies of heat or even cold that are moving through your body in a very powerful way. Along with the physical energy, we also need the release of the mental or creative energy that's within us. As we all know, people in mania have lots of ideas, and when a person's in a psychosis, the deep flow of psychosis, it's important to share these ideas and express them no matter how crazy they are, and the people supporting us need to be patient and listen instead of trying to shut us up. In order to give your supporters a break, maybe express yourself in your writing, doing writing or artistic expression. I find mandalas very good for allowing people to express themselves. Or even dancing or singing, basically anything creative that can help you express what you're going through as you heal. So is that it? Well, not quite, but I'm out of time. My 10 minutes are up, and you're probably exhausted by now. So while you take a break, I'll get started on part 2 in this series and how we heal our souls during psychosis. And there I'm going to talk about subjects like family secrets and perhaps most controversial of all, how we deal with the violence and aggression that's associated with bipolar disorder. So that's up next. In my last video, I talked about how various traumas, repressions, and different energies need to come out of us during periods of psychosis in order for us to heal bipolar disorder. However, there is one part of the healing that, while not so disturbing for the bipolar person, can be extremely disturbing for our families. So disturbing, in fact, that they could motivate them to want you medicated for your entire life. And what is this horrific thing that needs to be stopped at all costs? The truth. Family secrets. Everybody's got them. And they're not all so horrible. For example, when I found out when I was about 15 that every time my grandfather talked about his time in college, he was actually talking about the time he spent in jail for fraud. As it turned out, for years, college had been the family code word for prison. And then there was the time I found out I was part Micmac Indian. Actually, I found that pretty cool. However, for most of us, the truths we need to talk about during psychosis are much more serious than that. Family secrets such as rape or incest, if mentioned, can tear apart the entire family structure. Now, these secrets could be of a personal nature, like telling the family that you're gay. It could be just stating the obvious, like perhaps that your parents haven't loved each other for 20 years, even though they keep acting like they do. Or it could be something that you did that you consider to be a sin. And it was from working with a few people in psychosis, as well as receiving a lot of emails, that I gained a new appreciation for the ritual of confession within the Catholic Church. Because it became apparent to me that a lot of us, maybe all of us, are carrying around stuff that we want to get off our chest. Now, in my case, my parents were quite receptive to what I had to say, but I know for the most part, parents usually aren't. Typical responses from parents when bipolar people bring up the truth are things like, "Well, what are you getting so emotional about?" Or, "You're crazy, your thoughts are wrong." Or, "I don't understand you, haven't we given you a good life?" These are all ways that the family denies the truth of what the bipolar person is saying. And then to make matters worse, when confronted with all this truth, they take the person to the psychiatrist, who covers the whole thing over with the biggest lie of all, which is that the person is mentally ill. That's why they're having these thoughts and feelings. The reason they're mentally ill is they've got a chemical imbalance, they need drugs, and their thoughts and feelings are basically to be ignored. And of course, this is a huge relief for the family, who can now wash their hands of the whole experience, knowing that there's nothing really wrong with them or their family. The only problem is that their daughter has a little bit too much serotonin going to the brain. Or maybe it's dopamine. Or maybe it's not enough serotonin. I don't know, I get mixed up. So when the opportunity presents itself, clearing of the conscience of personal secrets, family secrets, untold truths, sins of the past, can be a very healing experience when you're in psychosis. Now, there's one family secret that is, in a sense, universal to all families, and yet most people are completely unaware of it. And that secret is that on this planet today, it is highly unlikely that you're going to have two parents that love you unconditionally. What is far more likely, even in the best of families, even in the most healthy of families, is that you may have one parent that loves you unconditionally. You feel their presence of love anytime you're with them, and you feel that you can do no wrong with that one parent, but the other parent will never give you a break, never let you feel like you're completely worthy of their love. If you're doing well in high school, they'll push you, "Why aren't you getting a part-time job?" Once you graduate university, they'll be pushing you to get a full-time job. Then once you've got that, when are you getting married? When are you having kids? When are you planning for your retirement? It never ends. So why does your father or mother do that to you? Why do they hold back love? Well, they don't do it consciously. They do it because their father or mother, your grandparents, held back love from them. And the reason your grandparents held back love is because your great-grandparents held back even more love. In fact, the further you go back in time, generation to generation, what you'll see is an increasing level of general coldness and rigidity among the generations. And that's because the further back you go in your family history, the lower the level of consciousness you will encounter among the people there. And with a lower level of consciousness comes a lower capacity for compassion, not only with your own family, but with other people around you. And the two best examples of this lower level of consciousness is what was going on with women's rights 100 years ago. Basically, women weren't even treated as citizens. And then, of course, there's the racism. You really think Barack Obama would have beat Teddy Roosevelt? Somehow, I think not. Now, please keep in mind when I talk about a generation, I am referring generally, and that in any generation of people or in any culture, some people were ahead of others. So that someone like Abe Lincoln or Nelson Mandela were clearly ahead of the level of consciousness of their own cultures. And what's the end result of receiving this coldness that has come down from our ancestors? Well, it basically leaves us with a feeling of a void in our soul, a sense of emptiness in our life, because we didn't receive all of the unconditional love that we could have when we were young. Now, the good news is that there's a tremendous opportunity to heal this void in the soul when a person's in psychosis. The only trouble is how you go about healing this void in the soul is very controversial in itself, because what it requires is that when the person in psychosis asks for affectionate love, that love be delivered by the support people or by the therapist. So in practical terms, what that means is that the person in psychosis may look to a supporter for a tremendously warm, affectionate, loving embrace. And while the support person needs to maintain the sacred spirit of the experience, not allowing things to become sexual, the intensity of affection shared could be extremely intimate, the type that we usually only reserve for our lovers. Now, this kind of contact is considered illegal today because of the risk of sexual impropriety, and in fact the great psychiatrist Dr. John Weir Perry lost his license because he was providing this kind of warm affection to female clients. However, Dr. Stangroff insists on the therapeutic benefits of this approach, saying that basically once your soul's void is filled, you're no longer looking for mother figures or father figures in your relationships, and you can find someone that's better suited to your true personality. So just to finish off, whether you're trying to fill this soul's void, or whether you're trying to speak truths or personal secrets that have been hidden for years, both of these movements are trying to bring a deeper level of integrity to your life as you move forward. So while what you're doing or saying may shock people or rock the boat for a short period of time, down the road these movements are going to make for a better life for you, making you healthier and more alive. It'll also allow you to raise your kids, whenever you have them, with a little more warmth than you had growing up. And finally, please remember that while all of these issues have a lot to do with our families, especially our parents, try to keep in mind that chances are if you've got it rough, probably your parents had it even tougher from their parents, and that the people out there with the biggest problems to deal with are the people with no parents at all. Next up, how to deal with and heal aggression during psychosis. Every once in a while, a person with bipolar disorder can get quite aggressive and violent. They may even go into a complete rage. And these aggressive outbursts can even be turned towards themselves in the form of suicide. And as psychiatry would have it, the reasons for these violent outbursts and suicidal tendencies are because you're mentally ill. But if that were the case, how is it that Trezirea House was able to take care of over 200 people with acute schizophrenia over 12 years, leaving them completely unmedicated? In fact, the book Trezirea reports that only 10 minor injuries happened over that time period among the staff members, and no major injuries at all.
And what on earth was John Weir Perry thinking at his clinic Diabasis, where he created a rage room which encouraged people to get in touch with their anger and express it in a controlled and protective setting? So once again, I found myself a little confused. Did bipolar disorder cause violence, aggression, and suicide? Or was something else going on beneath the surface? So to get a deeper understanding of this problem, I went to my bipolar friends at newlightbeings.com, a social network, and I asked them, what do you think made you violent or aggressive? And in another question, I asked them what made them think of committing suicide if they had at all. And what I found out from the responses was that, while yes, when the ego collapses and a person goes into psychosis, there is repressed aggression that can occasionally come out. However, for many bipolar people, our aggression doesn't rear its ugly head until we're in the hands of the system that is supposed to be taking care of us. And at least initially, it's usually the system that is a lot more aggressive with us than we are with it. I've never been violent unless you include struggling to get away from the police, who are violent to me. Then once hospitalized, the person in psychosis will often find themselves in the middle of a violent, absurd nightmare. The confrontation with the cold and violent reality of the hospital, restraining, chemical and physical prisons, was just not understandable to me. I only became aggressive when trying to defend myself from needles or other perceived threats. When I got to the hospital, I got strapped to a bed, and the doctor came in with a big needle. I started yelling really hard, "You are killing me! You are Bush!" Speaking personally, I think that my aggression came out of the deep knowledge that I was experiencing something vitally important and sacred, and that my hospitalization was interfering with this process. Or as one New Light being described, I believe this rage is some form of primal defense or warning. Try and remove a lion cub from the pride, and the lioness will stop at nothing to kill you. She doesn't display this rage out of love for her cub, no. She's in a rage because you're fucking with evolution. Once through the initial trauma of hospitalization, the bipolar person then has to face their warm and friendly psychiatrist. I got angry in the MD's office with my husband and father. I was trying to talk to my husband and explain my paranoia when the MD told him not to listen to me. That was very insulting and frustrating. It's as if the psychiatric profession has no idea of how sensitive we are when we're in psychosis and how much in need we are of compassion and understanding. I was coming so far from that other dimension that my brain just couldn't manage the information of a world where bad and wrong exist. I was obsessed with the idea of spiritual freedom, and in my view I was being persecuted by the machine in an attempt to suppress me and imprison me in their narrow view of a bleak reality. I felt spiritually raped. And then, if you're lucky enough to get out of the hospital, the medications have an effect all of their own, particularly when you're trying to withdraw off of them. I am certain that my anger, in fact my entire manic episode, was caused when my doctor reduced my meds without proper gradual tapering. Ritalin is apparently something nobody should go on because it causes uncontrollable fits of rage when it wears off. Effexor, an evil poison if there ever was one. The bipolar New Light beings also felt that medications had a very strong connection to the suicidal tendencies as well. Feeling like you're poisoning yourself every time you put a chemical clump of crap into your mouth is a slow form of suicide in some ways, isn't it? It was for me. To me, the reasons for wanting to kill yourself are much more complex, but the relationships to meds can be a hell of a good trigger. But it's not only the world of psychiatry that can make us violent, angry, and suicidal, it's the way we're received by our friends and family as well. Only one of my friends stuck around from that part of my life. What hurts me most is how they look at me like I'm the Frankenstein monster, and how they disregard everything I say because I'm crazy to them. Most of my family talks to me like I'm a dummy, and they're scared to be in the same room with me. Or for those who are more spiritual, they think I'm a witch, and that's why I'm punished for life with this disease. Realizing that my family and friends would only accept me again if I would surrender to lifelong medication, I took an overdose of liquid anesthetic. So while it may not be this way for everybody, many bipolar people, once diagnosed, find themselves marginalized and pathologized by society. And with a much dimmer future than they had planned staring them in the face. Wouldn't you be angry? Maybe even suicidal? I was helpless and alone and angry and pretty out of myself.
They tied me up to a bed to make sure I didn't try that again.
Back in the 80s, when I was at the University of Toronto, I did 2 research reports on why normal people commit suicide, not necessarily people with bipolar disorder. And what I found among these so-called normal suicidal people was that the main reason that they wanted to kill themselves was exactly the same as why a bipolar person would want to kill themselves. Infinite hopelessness. In the long run, the worst message you can give to a human being is to tell them that their psychological and spiritual problems are biochemical disorders or diseases, because it disempowers them. Dr. Peter Bregan, author of Your Drug May Be Your Problem. So, with this deeper understanding of why people are aggressive and suicidal, maybe we can start to understand this suicide note written by one of our new light beings. I beg for God to please have mercy on my soul. My soul is only the victim of my mind. Please release me of this world that shows no mercy to me, and allow my body to lay in the ground. Float my soul to the sky. Forgive me of my sins. I have been in agonizing pain for 12 years.
Fortunately for all of us, especially her son, Allison survived that suicide attempt, and actually attributes the survival to a new, more spiritual outlook on life. Allison, I hope you don't mind me stealing a few words from your page at New Light Beings. My internal suffering has saved my soul. I am deeply and madly in love with this soulful ride I experience inside my human shell. So am I, Allison. So am I. Why can't mainstream psychiatry or psychology heal bipolar disorder? Why do religions continually demonize mental illness? Why is the experience of a manic episode treated as meaningless when it feels so meaningful? The answer to these and many other questions is quite simple, really. We are still evolving. Evolution used to be a word on the tip of everybody's tongue when we were growing into the modern world. Remember Charles Darwin and survival of the fittest and all that? And certainly it looked like, for a time there, with the advances of science, that clearly evolution was in progress, and we were certainly making material progress. There's no doubt about that. However, in my opinion, starting in the 1980s, people started to look around and wonder what exactly we were doing on the planet. Is this the way we want to evolve? We're working harder than ever. We're totally stressed out. We're stuck in traffic. We're polluting the environment. We're destroying all the wildlife on the planet. And I know I'm not the only one who's looked around and thought, is this evolution? Something has gone seriously wrong. Maybe at some point in history we had made a wrong turn somehow, or maybe we should have stayed in agricultural, pre-industrial society, or maybe we should have stayed in tribal society where we were one with nature, even if we didn't know how to read. So with all this said, I was greatly relieved to find the work of Ken Wilber, who, starting with his book, A Brief History of Everything, really set me straight about how we are evolving, and that while scientific materialist society, the society that really runs our world today, is clearly in decline, what are emerging are more open, loving, spiritual levels of consciousness, and these levels of consciousness are absolutely critical for helping us to understand why we've had this huge upsurge in bipolar disorder in the last 15 years, and how for the first time since we left that tribal Garden of Eden, we are actually able to heal bipolar disorder without psychiatry in the midst of our own friends and in our own homes. So what are these so-called spiritual levels of consciousness? Well, like Ken Wilber, I prefer to borrow from the work of Dr. Clare Graves, who spent his entire career sociologically verifying the existence of these different levels of consciousness on our planet. His theory of consciousness he calls spiral dynamics. Dr. Graves discovered that there are basically 7 different realities on our planet today, 7 different levels of consciousness, where people work and live and think and operate from 7 completely different perspectives.
He also anticipates that even higher levels of consciousness will emerge in the future. As you will see once I get into the descriptions, these levels of consciousness really function almost like a series of Russian dolls, where in the beginning of existence we started with this very limited sense of consciousness of who we are, and then at certain points in our evolution we in a sense shed the skin or shed the shell of this Russian doll in order to have a deeper, more meaningful experience of life.
Now, I know some people are going to have a problem with this idea of hierarchy being here, but what you need to understand is that without hierarchy, there is no growth. Think about your own life. Are you the same person now that you were when you were 10 years old or when you were 5 years old? No, you've grown in your evolution of consciousness. And people understand that when we talk about growing up through childhood. But when we actually look at adults and we say, oh, one adult is more conscious than another adult, then we get into problems. We clearly understand this with our education system, where we start in first gear, like grade school, then we move up to high school, then on to university, and then possibly a master's program. A master's program, in this sense, is clearly better than grade school. So while we get this with our education system, the idea that you personally have a limited level of consciousness which needs to grow or will grow eventually, many people, or most people, will find very disturbing. Even I find it disturbing. Unfortunately, developing your own consciousness isn't always as easy as simply picking up a book. Sometimes we really need to let our old ways die and break out of that shell, or in this case, our box. So here's a quick introductory look at the 7 different levels of consciousness introduced in spiral dynamics. Level 1, archaic. Back 50,000 years ago, the world was a very dangerous place, and all these guys could do was just fight to stay alive day to day. And how did they survive? Well, just on their instincts. They didn't have a brain to think too much, so their focus was just get food, water, warmth, have sex, safety, find a cave. That's it. It didn't get much deeper than that for the caveman. Level 2, tribal. Now, what's so wizardly about the tribal level of consciousness? Well, 10,000 years ago, when the tribal level was very strong, these people saw the world in an entirely magical way. Now, it wasn't always good magic, but it was always magic. And the magic was used to influence the spirits, the spirit world, which was everywhere. So the big mission in their life was to keep the spirits happy so that the tribe could be safe. So in order to keep them happy, a big focus of their lives were obeying the spirits, being very obedient, and as well obedient to their ancestors, their chief, their elders, their entire tribe. They needed to respect and honor the tribe, and part of that involved participating in the sacred rituals and rites of passage ceremonies for the tribe. Level 3, feudal. Freed from the constraints of the tribe, my world now is all about me, and my mission is to get whatever I want. And doing that ain't easy because it's a jungle out there, so you need to demand respect. And with so much of their focus on self-gratification, these guys know how to party better than any other level. That is until level 4 comes along, because the traditional level of consciousness will show you the error of your ways. At this point, the world becomes purposeful, and your mission is to live your life with a sense of morality. I mean, what's going to happen to you after you die? Are you going to go to hell? Or are you going to go to heaven? So at the traditional level, people start to control their impulsivity by following the moral code of their religion, and hopefully if they've been good, they'll get salvation in the afterlife. And now, even though there's a lot of guilt that comes with this level, because you know you're a sinner, you know you've been a bad boy, in the long run, it builds character. It really does. So while religion does build character with its morality, some of the beliefs associated with these religions, they don't have any scientific basis. So at level 5, the modern level, it is science that becomes the religion. Our new world becomes about achieving success, not only in our eyes, but especially in the eyes of others. The new mission becomes to play the game to win, and to play by the rules, unless you can cheat without getting caught. At this point, both societies and individuals prosper with the advances that come from technology and a marketplace that is highly competitive. Unlike previous levels, change becomes a natural, ongoing part of life with constant innovation, and the whole point is to create the good life. Screw the planet. Recognizing that for many of us, the ways of the modern world have meant the internet superhighway to nowhere, along comes level 6, the postmodern level. And at this point, for the first time ever, all of a sudden, it seems like we can see the world from many truths.
Up until now, every level has thought that it just had the answer. But these people see the world in pluralistic terms, many truths, many moralities. Who's right? Who's wrong? Who knows? So the mission here is to bring harmony through understanding. And for the first time ever, we're really listening to each other. And for the first time since science told you that God doesn't really exist, you start to awaken to a new sense of spirituality, and you return to the deeper questions of the meaning in life and start to question your material focus on just solely money, status, and power. Like, is that the only reason we're here, just to survive? And along with checking out other cultures and other ways of doing things in your quest, you might just step in and try and help the planet Earth heal a little bit along the way. Now, Level 6 is convinced there's many ways to look at the world, many truths, but there's only one problem. None of the other levels see it that way. So they're always fighting with them. They fight with people for being narrow-minded. So as a result, they're fighting with just about 80% of the world's population, because for the rest of us, there are no other realities. There's my reality. Screw the rest. You're all wrong. And that's part of what makes Level 7 so interesting, is that for the first time in human history, we have a growing population of people who are not fighting with other levels of consciousness. Part of the reason is they see value in all the other levels. They see value in multiple perspectives, in morality, in success, in egotistic impulse. They see value in survival and security. Every level has its reason for being, and every level has value. So at Level 7, people stop being so damn manipulative. They stop trying to force people to be what they're not. They leave people as they are, and when there's an opening for them to grow, they try and help them out. That's about it. Also, unlike the other levels, they're not so focused on trying to become something. They're not trying to do things to strive to become something better than they are. They recognize that the joy of life and success in life come from putting all of your focus and all of your energy into where you are right now. Just like Eckhart Tolle's book says, The Power of Now. So that's why I'm calling this level the Power of Now level. The world they see is one of integrated levels of consciousness where each has value, and your mission is to just be. In practical terms, this just being, means putting a lot of passionate involvement into what you're doing right now, but not with a striving attitude trying to be something you're not. This attitude brings a very flexible approach to life, so you're not thinking, okay, I need to do this in order to get this. In this way, life becomes much more spontaneous, because the focus isn't so much in worrying about what's the correct way to do things, but in simply which way is going to work best. And with a lot less worrying in your life, life becomes much more playful and creative. It's almost like you can pour everything into what you're doing, but you're not so worried about the outcomes. Okay, that's it. That's your 7 levels of consciousness. Now, in my next video in this series, I'm going to demonstrate how different levels of consciousness interpret mental illness, particularly bipolar disorder, and why people at the higher levels of consciousness are in a position where they can help support people with bipolar disorder so that they can heal. So what does bipolar disorder have to do with different levels of consciousness? Well, it turns out a lot. And to illustrate my point, the first thing I'm going to do is talk to you about the different people we worked with who had bipolar disorder this year. So the first person I'll talk about is my younger niece, who I will call here Anna. It's really her story that got me involved in this subject in the first place. Now, for those of you who don't know me, 12 years ago I was sent to a psychiatric hospital with an experience that other people saw as insanity, but I was sure was very beneficial to me. I eventually discovered that what I had had was not a mental illness at all, but what was called a spiritual emergency. Dr. Stan Groff, Dr. David Lukoff, and others recommend that spiritual emergencies not be medicated or hospitalized because allowing them to process can be very beneficial to the person in crisis. Now, before my wife and I met Anna, she had already been in her experience for 3 days and was already being heavily medicated by psychiatry. So my big question at the time was Anna mentally ill, or was she having an experience like my own, something like a spiritual emergency? To start, our experiences had a lot more similarities than there were differences. We both went through periods of high energy levels, had a strong desire to take off our clothes. Our sense of taste, smell, vision, all of that heightened. We had strong feelings of euphoria during the experience, and we both became extremely emotional. As far as differences go, the biggest difference was in our background. I had had my crisis at the age of 30, and I had been university educated and well-traveled by then. And she had her crisis when she was only 17 years old and just leaving high school, going on to university. If there was one big difference, it was how we approached the experience. I saw mine as a deeply sacred thing, and I knew it was a special thing to go through. And while she had some spiritual aspects, on the whole, she was experiencing a lot of fear. She was afraid to go upstairs in her own house without her mother with her. That's how disturbed she was by the experience. And while I did take strong action to understand what happened to me, I avoided seeing psychologists or psychiatrists because I didn't think they understood what happened to me, and I didn't take any medication after my 3-day hospitalization. Anna, on the other hand, was quite quick to comply with what her parents and psychiatrist wanted her to do. She's been seeing a psychiatrist and psychologist and has been medicated indefinitely. Convinced that Anna was not mentally ill, I went to work studying the difference between a spiritual emergency, which is what I had had and been so beneficial, and this bipolar disorder, this thing called bipolar disorder that she was being labeled with. And thanks to the YouTube community, I discovered that many people who have been labeled with bipolar disorder had experiences in acute psychosis that were identical to my own spiritual emergency. Along with the symptoms Anna showed, there can be experiences of oneness and timelessness, a sense of all-knowing the universe, and even a sacredness to the experience. You can experience delusions and hallucinations, usually of a spiritual nature. You will also think that you're dreaming or in some sort of a play or a dream world, and in this dream world you will want to test reality, which could lead you to want to walk through walls or even smash your car. Other symptoms can include the sense that you're being tested by God, that you're the Messiah, the prophet, or a saint. More and more, it looked like spiritual emergencies and bipolar disorder were the same thing. And then, just as I was figuring all this stuff out, Anna's older sister, Eliana, had an experience of her own. And once again, the initial symptoms were identical to Anna's and my own. And Ileana strongly conveyed the experiences of the spiritual emergency as well, the oneness, timelessness, delusions, testing reality. Now, knowing what had happened to her sister, once her crisis got deeper, she called us immediately, and we supported her for 5 days completely unmedicated and without hospitalization. Now, to my surprise, Ileana had much deeper experiences than I did. She had very deep out-of-body experiences, which had her feeling no pain for 3 days, even though she was bumping into things. She felt that she was in her mother's womb and actually started to re-experience the birth happening all over again. In general, even though most of her experience with us was quite pleasant, once she came back, she was quite disturbed and frightened by the whole thing. While the bulk of her psychosis happened in the first manic episode, she would go on to have 2 more, and it was only after the third psychosis, which happened about 2 months later, that she was able to feel that she had a genuine rebirth and was finally able to get back to normal life. So the whole thing took about 2 months. Based on this limited experience, one thing became very clear, which is that Ileana never would have made it through her process without our aggressive interventions. And yet, for some reason, I had been able to get through this experience totally unsupported. How? My first clue came when I started talking to Anna, and I realized that she didn't recognize any sacredness to the experience that she had been going through, like I had 12 years earlier. And in talking to her about God, it became very clear that her God was quite a concrete Jesus figure. Jesus was God for her, and this is the person she prayed to for guidance. So like all people at the traditional level of consciousness, her approach to the divine was clearly a religious one. And in the religious mindset, God is clearly above you and separate from you, and for people to have an experience of God is a very rare thing that only tends to happen to prophets, saints, these sort of people. So for anyone of the traditional religious mindset, the first thought is that an actual experience of God is in fact impossible. It's a lot more likely that what's happening to you is the work of the devil. Now, in contrast to Anna, I had moved into the postmodern level of consciousness at about the age of 28. At that point in time, I awakened to the fact that while God could be outside of you, God could also be within you. And as a result, when I went into my psychosis 2 years later, the sacredness of it was unmistakable. So whereas I was able to trust this process and go with it, Anna was very unsure of what was happening and trusted the authority figures who told her to stop it immediately. And in her case, these authority figures were at the modern level. That's where our medical model is today. And similar to the traditional level, any psychosis, spiritual or otherwise, should be blocked immediately, not because it's the work of the devil, but because it's a malfunction of your biological machinery. And it was at this modern level that Eliana had been exploring reality. Much like a social scientist, she had been traveling France recently and found the culture there fascinating and found herself a little bit confused as to what was the truth, which was the proper way to live, the right way to live, the French way or the Brazilian way, which way was right. And unlike traditional people that always carry a cultural bias, Eliana was looking at things in a very objective, factual way. And with this rational approach to life, she really showed her modern level of consciousness. Now, while all this was happening, I was getting a lot of email coming in through YouTube, and by now I've probably talked to over 200 people who have had some sort of psychosis. And one thing was very surprising. Some people were making it through, as I had, unsupported. They were healing, and what was really interesting was that all of these people that were healing were fitting into the postmodern level of consciousness. Just like the postmodern profile, these people had a deeper interest in spirituality than normal, and when their experiences came, they often did come related to some sort of spiritual practice or insight that came related to their relationship with God. They were almost always university educated, and generally over the age of 25. Almost all of them were over the age of 25. And how did they do it? Well, they recognized it for the sacred experience that it was, and they surrendered to the process. Now, I want to remind you that this was a small group of people among the postmodern types that had this rebirth as I did and came through unmedicated. Everyone else was having their process blocked, either by the psychiatry and psychology of the modern level, by the religion of the traditional level, or even by their own fears. So, how do levels of consciousness affect bipolar disorder? Well, for one, it's only at the postmodern level of consciousness that we start to open up to the possibility of a positive spiritual manic experience. And as a result of this open attitude, some postmoderns are able to heal their disorder without support, simply by surrendering to the experience with faith. In contrast, people at the modern and traditional levels cannot heal without support because their level of consciousness is not prepared for this spiritual experience. And neither are the institutions of mainstream psychiatry, mainstream psychology, and organized religions, all of which harm what should be a sacred healing process. However, healing is possible for people at other levels, with loving support and a level 7 power of now approach to this psychosis. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So, what is this revolutionary new power of now approach to healing bipolar disorder? Just be. Be with the people that are in psychosis and truly connect with them. Dr. Loren Mosher knew what I was talking about back in the 70s when he based the whole approach at Trezirea House, a place for healing people with acute schizophrenia, on the idea of being with the person in crisis as opposed to doing something to them. Mosher writes, Trezirea saw the person in psychosis as someone to be with, tolerated, interacted with, indeed appreciated. Dr. John Weir Perry at his project Diabasis, which he talks about in his book Trials of a Visionary Mind, took a very similar approach with the extra added step of not only being with the person in psychosis, but encouraging them to deeply engage what they are encountering in their mystical experiences. Perry writes, the intention of such therapy is to honor what the other person experiences with a readiness to receive her whole being, to relate to all that is in her, and thus to share in her psychic life and be in it with her during this critical period of growth. Now let's compare that approach to that of the late and not so great Sigmund Freud. From Peter Kramer's book, Freud, Inventor of the Modern Mind, Freud is quoted as saying, I cannot advise my colleagues too urgently to model themselves during psychoanalytic treatment on the surgeon who puts aside all feelings, even his human sympathy. Apparently, Freud's modern mind is far behind the times. The importance of being with people empathetically as opposed to doing something to them was found to be so critical that it was actually college undergraduates making, on today's dollars, about $10 an hour that were found to be actually more effective than trained and licensed psychiatrists or psychologists in helping people through their acute psychosis. Because they are unburdened by preconceived theories, non-professional staff members are free to be themselves and to be spontaneous with psychotic individuals. In contrast, highly trained mental health personnel often replace this freedom with cognitive, abstract, learned responses that can invalidate the patient's experience. So if you're looking to heal your bipolar disorder, it certainly seems that this guy will be a lot more effective than this guy in helping you heal. Now, to actually be able to just be in the present moment with somebody is a remarkably simple thing to do. And in truth, each of us have glimpses of living in the present moment every single day of our lives. We're just not aware of it. For example, anytime we're in a really meaningful conversation that energizes us, we're in the present moment. We're just being in the present moment. Anytime we find ourselves working on a project that initially we thought of as maybe a lot of work, but then we find that we're actually enjoying the process, that's being in the present moment. Whenever you spontaneously tell a joke that just makes everybody crack up, that's being in the present moment. I know I'm in the present moment whenever I visit a new city and start to explore it for the first time. But in truth, any activity in your life can be one in which you are in the present moment, and the easiest way to tell if you're in the present moment is to look at your watch. So far, this video has been about 3.5 minutes. Now for you, has it been a fast 3.5 minutes or a slow 3.5 minutes? If the time seemed to go by quickly or you didn't notice the time passing at all, you're in the present moment. But if you're looking at that little clock in the lower right-hand corner and you're wondering how much longer I'm going to be and you're thinking about where you've got to be next, you are not in the present moment. In fact, where you are, or where your attention is, I should say, is either in the future or in the past, usually worrying about the future and often because of what happened in the past. Now, there is one person that is always in the present moment, and that is the person who's in an acute psychosis. For the person in psychosis, they seem to be living in an eternal now. They have no sense of time whatsoever. And as a support person, if you're not being with the person in psychosis in that present moment, they can really feel it, because to them it feels like a coldness or a hostility that you're emitting. And they will often react to you in a very negative or even violent way. Conversely, when you are being with them, simply being, that is a state of love. And they can feel that love and will respond to it in a very positive way. Now, while just being sounds simple, it's not always so easy when put into practice for most people. I mean, as a supporter, would you be able to simply be in the present moment as you watch the person in psychosis piss all over your Persian rug? Would you be able to stay in the present moment watching someone who's your boyfriend or girlfriend put their arms around another support person and express genuine love and affection for that person and not you? Will you stay in the present moment when your friend takes all their clothes off and tries to jump out the window? Most people in these situations are simply going to hit the panic button, call an ambulance, call the police, get them over there, and just wipe their hands of it. That's why the ideal support person needs to be someone who's got an extremely warm and empathetic heart, and yet can stay as cool as a cucumber when the shit hits the fan. Now, up until now, I've talked about this level 7 power of now level as being a new awakening of consciousness, and in a sense it is for the culture, but that awareness has been with us for thousands of years. Various shaman, mystics, yogis, and monks from around the world have been aware of the importance of being rather than doing for anyone that wants to have a lasting sense of inner peace. The Japanese practice of Zen Buddhism is completely focused on the exercise of pushing yourself into the here and now. In the Chinese scripture, the Tao Te Ching, to simply be was to be the equivalent of being one with God, or as they called it, one with the Tao. The Tao pours everything into life. It is a cornucopia that never runs dry. It is the deep source of everything. It is nothing and yet in everything. 30 years ago, the importance of this highly spiritual approach to living was not lost on John Weir Perry. In the field of therapy of all kinds, we have a good deal to learn from Taoism. This doctrine's mode of being in the world is a way of action that does not force effects but allows them. Now, many people have theorized about why this approach to healing psychosis has not caught on as it should have, being much more effective than leaving people medicated for their entire lives. And in my opinion, most of the voices in the anti-psychiatry movement have pointed to the money and influence of Big Pharma as being the reason why this type of approach hasn't spread. However, it's my opinion that being primarily a modern culture, we simply haven't reached the level of consciousness yet where we can do the kind of work that's needed on a widespread basis. 10 years ago, the book Spiral Dynamics estimated that there was only about 1 or 2% of people operating at the Power of Now level, level 7, with another 10 to 15% operating at the postmodern level. Everyone else was functioning at the modern level or lower. So in other words, even today in 2008, for the vast majority of people, the very idea of simply being with somebody in an acute psychosis as opposed to doing something to them will be completely absurd and unacceptable. Or as Sigmund Freud said, if one wanted to make a living from the treatment of nervous ailments, one had to do something for them. So while the bad news is that many people have suffered at the hands of psychiatry for the last 100 years, totally misunderstood, The good news is that things are changing, and they are changing very quickly. At the beginning of the 20th century, I think it's very safe to say that probably 90% of the world's population was at the traditional level of consciousness and lower. It's only in the last 100 years that we've had the modern, the postmodern, and the power of now level all become part of our society. So, as more people are evolving into the postmodern and power of now levels of consciousness, we're going to have more people that are able to understand what needs to happen and are capable of doing it. Or let me correct that, are capable of doing nothing, just being. For those of you out there who are still struggling with this idea of just being, I highly recommend Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now. It's really addressed at people that are having specific concerns with this idea and are trying to apply it to their own life. And if you're interested in how I came to adopt this philosophy, you could pick up my book, A Quiet Mind, A Mystic Journey Out of Insanity, which coincidentally started with my psychosis. For additional information on any of the books I mentioned in my videos, you can check out my Bipolar or Waking Up blog, where I have a book list on the right-hand side.